so it's nice to be back. As Jenna said, I've studied a lot of different things and have attempted to integrate various approaches, and that's part of what I'm going to do tonight. Is one of the main goals of my talk tonight is just to bring some different perspectives together and kind of explain some of the crossover and how it works, because I think there's such a separation in the field of mental health as far as different schools of thought and different ways of working. Obviously, as more and more integration happens, there's the need for agreeing on some common language and some understanding of various approaches. One of the main reasons being in the case of differential diagnosis. Right now we have a situation where no matter what a person's dealing with, whichever therapist that person calls and whatever approach that person works from, that person just takes that client on and does that approach, and there's not much in the way of trying to diagnose what's really going on here and what kind of treatment approach would be most appropriate. And so clients are kind of on their own to do several weeks or several months or several years in a certain kind of approach to eventually realize maybe that's not the approach I need. And so it's obviously not efficient, and it's expensive, and it does a disservice to the client, and ultimately a disservice to everyone with regard to money spent, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not like it's an easy thing to make happen, though. Obviously, it's not. You know, there's good reason why there's that problem. One of them being that it's not so easy to just diagnose a mental health issue. Most people being therapists here, we all know that you look through the DSM and no matter which malady or disorder you read about, you recognize that disorder in yourself, and you recognize that disorder in every other person you've ever met. And so diagnosis is a pretty vague, confusing territory to try to navigate. Specifically tonight, I'm going to try to speak to the two different polarities of the spectrum as far as psychosis and spiritual emergence. Lots of different words obviously get used as far as spiritual emergence and the idea of spiritual emergency, the idea of transpersonal experiences. Just to kind of get a sense of where people are at. Generally speaking, there's the idea of direct experiences that would be in the category of spiritual experiences that are considered to be of a very different quality than cognitive, rational, personal experiences that are emotional and mental versus altered states of consciousness where it's an experience of a very different kind of sense of self or different sense of reality. Just show of hands, as far in general, I kind of think of three different categories. There's the people that feel like they've had those kinds of experiences. There's the people that feel like they have not, but they believe some people have, and then there's the people who don't believe those are real, that they are interpretations of something, but that they're not actually spiritual, a different kind of spiritual state that is possible. Would people be willing to show of hands as far as if you feel like you have directly experienced what you would consider to be altered states of consciousness or transpersonal states or spiritual states? Okay. And so that's the majority, so that's probably as far as I need to go right there. I'm going to try to speak to all three categories, and that's a part of this. Part of what I'm going to try to get at, and a couple of the points I'm going to try to make is that whether you believe in it or not, there's a few things that are important as a therapist to do or not do with So I'll just jump right into it. This idea of energy, and energy work, energy healing are in vogue terms these days. And the word energy kind of implies metaphysical or some kind of woo-woo thing. But if you look at Western psychology, the three main metapsychological viewpoints, starting with Freud and moving through all the other theorists, are all talking about energy. They're all talking about energy and the organization of energy. So this idea of energy isn't separate from or some other concept than these guys, these early psychological theorists were talking about. They were talking specifically about psychic energy and its movement, its organization, its management, etc. So it's really all the same stuff. Someone that's working with chakras, or someone that's doing consciousness work, or someone that's doing various types of psychotherapeutic work, it's all really energy work. There's just different words used and different ideas about the nature of that energy, different ideas about the origin of it, different ideas about how it is that that it gets managed, how it is that it gets structured, what good organization is, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm gonna go into the details of some of that. Generally speaking, good organization of energy is culturally dependent, right? It's different. Person to person is different, family to family is different, culture to culture, time period to time period. How we're behaving, how we're conceptualizing the world, how we're conceptualizing our sense of self is different in different areas and in different time periods. And so what we call normal, obviously, is not an absolute thing. And that's obviously an important thing to keep in mind as therapists, that clients are coming in and don't necessarily have the same set of values, the same set of ideas about what's real and what's not real, about what's healthy and what's not healthy. And as the rules in our society keep getting less and less rigid with regard to behavior, with regard to family systems, with regard to sexuality, with regard to spirituality, as that all gets less and less rigid, it gets more and more complicated as far as clients coming in, because there's more and more of a willingness to express differences in philosophies and worldviews. And so the therapist is left trying to figure out how to navigate that, not bring their own set of beliefs too much into the therapeutic encounter, but at the same time, you can't leave it all completely at the door, and so navigating it seems to be more and more of a dicey process. One of the ways that I deal with that, and one of the ways that I teach dealing with that, is that energy is energy. And if you think of energy as a vibration, and if you use the analogy like a radio wave, and that content is encoded on that wave, but that the content is different than the actual wave. And so if our minds are radio stations that are capable of tuning into different stations via turning the knob and tuning into different frequencies, the content that's playing at any given moment on that station is different than the idea of what station do you have your mind tuned to. And so when you shift into looking at subtle energy, you start looking just at vibration. And so vibration is vibration across cultures, across genders, across political views, etc. So that it's kind of a common language that can be used, and so it can be really helpful, especially when you're in the face of confusing content, confusing paradigms. You can shift to what's going on energetically right now in this relationship with this client. and you can track rapport, you can track openness or closeness, you can track resonance or dissonance, you can track whether or not there's a feedback loop that's happening that feels like it's having a therapeutic effect or not. And again, that's all outside of particular words. So, and with regard to energy, I'm going to get into this a little bit more, but as far as seeing energy, feeling energy, in the same way that I'm saying psychotherapy has always been about energy, even people who say, well, I don't believe in energy, I still would say those people can see energy and can feel energy. It's just that they're not calling it that. In the same way that everyone has emotion, and you know, you can be in a real mental state and be denying emotion, but there's emotion there. It's some kind of emotion. It's always happening. It's just a question of what is the emotion. And you can be denying emotion or splitting or repressing emotion, but emotion exists and it's there whether you wanted to call it by that word or not. So if I'm kind of laying some basic assumptions down as far as that I'm going to be speaking with or speaking from, because it's inescapable, right? Even though I'm saying we're in this situation where we try to not bring our own basic assumptions about reality, at the same time, to a certain extent, we have to. And so I'm just laying some of that out here to start with. As far as therapists, my understanding is, with regard to what is the goal of therapy, and obviously it can fluctuate and you can sort of negotiate that with the client, but generally speaking, the idea of helping a client to achieve a stable sense of self, stable relationships, and be able to function in society are three goals that are kind of general enough to use as parameters. As far as, if nothing else, we're trying to help that happen. Trying to help people be able to, whatever their view is and wherever they're coming from, to function in the society that they're currently living in. That the idea that's a good idea, that's a movement towards health versus away from it. And again, stable relationships and stable selfhood are kind of the three primary goals to the therapists are working towards. For the purposes of this talk, we're just going to ignore the fact that I'm personally failing in all three of those categories. No, only partially failing. So if that's the general goal, it brings up, okay, well, you know, even that's not very clear, right? We each have different ideas about what that really means, and there's lots of conversation that can have about that a person can have about that. But one of the main points I want to make is this: is that if good organization is stable selfhood, stable relationships, and fitting into society, good organization doesn't necessarily mean truth, right? Organization of energy doesn't really have anything to do with truth. It's a relative truth. It's a subjective truth. It's a truth that's relative to cultural norms, etc. And so keeping that in mind as therapists is extra important, because my understanding of psychotherapy in general and where it started, and certainly in the psychoanalytic tradition, it's not about telling clients what is appropriate, right? It's actually specifically about diving into the inappropriate, right? That was the whole start of this, was instead of, here's what's acceptable and appropriate behavior and you're not doing it right, you're supposed to behave like this.
That's more CBT.
What's that?
That's more CBT.
Right, right. Instead, it's what's going on in the person's consciousness or unconscious that is inappropriate, right? That's taboo, that's not on the surface, that maybe they aren't even aware of, or certainly that they're not sharing with everyone. Our job is diving into that territory. And to your point, I feel like the field in general has moved more and more away from that. And my sense is there's a need to go back towards that. Certainly in the training of therapists, it seems like it's more and more about these cognitive approaches and not enough training in how do you dive in to the unknown, disorganized, unconscious, inappropriate feelings, thoughts, energies, etc., that are moving around in clients. And this idea of outside the norm, I'm just going to use the simple model that psychosis is generally a disorganization of energy that is pre-personal organized energy that we generally think of as appropriate or functional. And then spiritual emergence is energy, consciousness, organizational structures that are post or beyond what we call personal. Now,